Thank you very much for choosing this session on solar geoengineering, in which I will give you a sort of story in the nutshell of my upcoming book, Dimming the Sun, which will come out in the US early next year, 25. Let's start with a question that sounds fairly simple, that's a bit frightening, and something most likely, having fun to guess a little bit. So who of you would think that Paris Agreement lower limit 1.5 degrees is still reachable? Still is? Below? Below is difficult because we basically in the last year we've already been there. But now you're a very optimistic person. I don't know, whatever miracle might happen, we decarbonize within the next couple of years in a radical form, and we'll stick with 2.5 degrees, possibly. I like optimism. Thanks for having it. So who of you thinks that we probably end up most likely with the upper limit of the Paris Agreement, so 2 degrees Celsius plus at the end of the century? A couple. You're also quite optimistic. You're definitely more optimistic than many scientists today. Who of you thinks, no, it's all not feasible? We end up 2.5 degrees or upwards. That's the majority, and you're very much in alignment with the scientists, the climate scientists of the IPCC. This is a very recent poll done by The Guardian. About half of the scientists, the climate scientists who are involved in the IPCC have responded, and about almost 80%, 75%, don't believe anymore that anything below 2.5 degrees is still feasible based on the trajectory we are right on now. And then you have a fair amount of the scientists who really go into dystopian prospects. If all the policy measures, all the promises made in the Paris process right now are implemented, that is the most likely figure we're going to end up with. So we can still hope that things speed up. We decarbonize much faster than the track we are on right now. But if we stay on the track we are with all the promises made, with all the policy measures that are already taken, that is the most likely scenario in the limits. What does it mean? I mean, if we end up there, end of the century, somewhere in between 2.5 or 3 degrees, well, it's very obvious. I mean, very obvious that we'll have a lot of heat waves and we'll have a lot more floods that we already have, and it's very likely that we'll have millions of heat deaths each year, especially because something that's called wet bulb temperatures will appear much more often than today. Wet bulb temperatures is the temperature, actually it's a mix between temperature and humidity, after which or under which conditions humans cannot exist anymore, even not for a couple of hours outside. It's somewhere above 50 degrees with low humidity. High humidity, it's closer to 40 degrees. If you have the combination of both, you definitely have to flee into a room with air conditioning. You cannot sustain outside. And as a consequence of debated, we'll have then, well, millions of deaths and a lot of migration, particularly from the global south towards the global north. And well, that's what we already see right now, is only probably a slim prospect of. You remember the scientists who were more on the 4 or 5 degrees prospect, they probably aware of or are afraid of tipping point cascade. We don't really know when they might kick in. These are prospects from the Global Institute, from the Potsdam Institute of Climate. Possible tipping points are, you've heard about it, the ice sheets in the north and in the western Arctic will probably fall first. Possibly we are already over these tipping points. We'll have in a scenario somewhere in between. They're very hard to predict, but somewhere in a scenario between 2 degrees and 3.5. We know that the Amazon rainforest rainforest will die back at some points. Same for the vegetation in West Africa. And we'll probably see that the monsoons will fail at a certain point. We already see the low latitude coral reefs going down, and well, permafrost and so forth. You've heard about it. It's a cascade that if it kicks in, one effect makes the other one or kicks off the other one, and then it will end up in these possible, truly dystopian sheets. This is, and that's the last chart of mine for bad news. Basically, you've all seen this chart. That's the annual carbon dioxide emissions worldwide from 1950 to 2023. We had that small dip during COVID. Since then, we are seeing CO2 emissions rising year on year. The optimistic scenario, the one who's truly believing it, he basically thinks that at the latest next year we're going steeply down. Possibly we'll see peak oil, peak gas in a couple of years, but it's very unlikely that then it'll be a very steep drop. But rather possibly humanity will still plateau with high CO2 emissions for quite a while before then slowly going down, which basically means, and you all know it, it'll be a disaster because, I mean, we'll still put year by year, we'll put that much carbon in the atmosphere. If you still have optimism, possibly, that's a very recent video by Trump.
So many bad things have happened to our country, but we're going to turn it around, and I think we can do it fast. We're going to drill, and we're going to be drilling like you have never seen before.
So this is on the campaign trail, 2 weeks old. Well, possibly we won't have him, or the world won't see him as the next US president, but it's a high likelihood. And it's not only about the US who might take back their promises. UK has done it. India is basically struggling by far not meeting the targets they've set, so they think about cutting down their promises. So basically what it all comes to, are we screwed? Man, it quite looks like we all know this. However, we might then, if we are screwed, consider something called solar geoengineering, which is controversial. Of course, it is controversial. Why is it controversial? Well, it's fairly easy to do, and it's fairly cheap, and we fairly know how to do it. Why do we know it? Because not only we as humans could do it, but also because nature does it. Solar geoengineering, or at least the most discussed approach to it, is basically doing what volcanoes do once in a while. They shoot up heaps of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere. The sulfur then creates a thin layer of an aerosol very up in the air, about 18 kilometers altitude, and then reflects sunlight back into space before it comes down to Earth. And that is what solar geoengineering is. It's basically reducing the solar forcing in order to sort of countervail the greenhouse effect. Well, please mark these words. Solar geoengineering is not a solution. If it comes down to the fact that we'll do it, it is only a stopgap solution. It is only a stopgap solution that can help us to transition to the post-fossil age. What's a stopgap solution? Think about, I don't know, you're on a high seas in a sailboat and you have a hole in the boat. Well, fixing the hole provisionally so that you can make it back on land is probably a good idea, but it'll still mean that you have to fix the boat for good if you want to keep on sailing. Solar geoengineering is only a stopgap solution if we consider it as being one possibility to gain time, to buy us time in order to avoid the worst. This is sort of the most or best known napkin diagram of solar geoengineering, which basically brings that buys us time idea in a fairly understandable metric. So this is what happens if we don't cut emissions. We do cut emissions, hopefully as aggressive as we could ever be. We could be more aggressive about it, but well, we're still making progress. So unless you really believe that you can really lower this down, this line down in a very short amount of time, or not scale up CO2 removal, sucking CO2 out of the air, scale those technologies that exist, but which are very expensive and very hard to scale right now, you should consider to cap the average temperature of the world somewhere around 1.8 to 2 degrees Celsius, and use the time you've in to cut aggressively and remove at scale. That is the only scenario in which solar geoengineering can make sense, but it might be at some point, or might become the best option we have to not enter a world 2.5 degrees, not risking to hit the tipping points, and not risking to have this cascade of tipping points kicking in. What are the technical options of it? Well, let's start at the bottom. Here, we could increase the albedo, the reflectivity of the Earth on the ground. First thing is making sure that the glaciers don't melt, that the ice shields at the poles don't melt. One level above, we could increase the reflectivity of the Earth system by seeding so-called marine clouds. They're fairly low clouds. We can sort of seed them by spraying salt in the air from boats, make those marine clouds that we already have brighter, so that their albedo goes up. We could also thin cirrus clouds. Cirrus clouds thinning, that's the technical term for it. Basically, the cirrus clouds, they sort of hinder infrared waves, so heat coming from the ground up, they hinder it to re-escape into space. So if we thin them, we'll sort of do a direct counter strategy versus the greenhouse effect. Then the most likely, the easiest, the volcano type, called stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI as the technical terms. And then for the science fiction fans amongst you, there are a couple of people who are also talking about putting large mirrors in the space, or even, and that's about the craziest idea, just shoot a lot of moon dust in between Sun and Earth, which would theoretically work, but practically hard to do. As I said, obviously, there are risks. The most obvious risk is geophysical. So if you've read about it, you probably heard that some people claim, some critics of solar geoengineering claim, well, if you do that, if humanity fiddles with the Earth's thermostat, possibly the monsoons will fail. Possibly, I mean, we are fiddling with a complex system, and then possibly everything gets out of control. We don't know anything. We don't know really the correlations. We don't know the causations, at least not good enough in the Earth system. So basically, we'll end up with a total weather freak show, possibly. There could be possibly interference with the ozone layer. The elderly amongst you remember the ozone hole of the 80s. That might come back. Or, that's another concern, obviously if you put a lot of sulfur in the stratosphere, at some point it'll come down It'll come down after 1 to 3 years. But the good news here is that the amounts of sulfur that are put in the stratosphere are not as big, much less than what came down in the acid rains in the 1980s. So, obviously, nobody has already done it. Volcanoes do it once in a while, and the best estimates that climate science has right now, what would happen if we would put a lot of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere, come from the last big volcano eruption, Pinatubo, in '91. However, from all what we know, the risks, from what the models say, are not as big as often claimed, especially. And that's what the responsible part of the solar geoengineering community always claims, particularly if you start doing it very slowly with low amounts and really measure well what happens. So, at least in geophysical, ecological risks, this seems, from what we know today, and we need more research here, fairly manageable. But there are other risks, and there are more light in human nature, and that's the technical term a lot of climate economists would use, the moral hazard. That basically means, in simple words, we humans are very good in finding excuses for ourselves to not do things that are hard to do. So the moral hazard about solar geoengineering is basically thinking, oh, now we have a silver bullet, let's not decarbonize, at least not as fast as we should do. And that is obviously a problem, and that is a problem that has to be addressed every single time people talk about solar geoengineering, has to, of course, reflect on what does it mean if people like Newt Gingrich and say, excellent solution. We should remind them that it's only a stopgap. It's definitely not a quick fix. Because if we start doing it, and if we don't decarbonize, or keeping on decarbonizing, or even decarbonize ideally faster than we do, we'd have to put more sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere year by year. And definitely then come to the point where the whole approach definitely becomes far too risky. However, I don't know how many among you have heard about solar geoengineering or have gotten deeper into the discussion of it. My experience is that many people barely heard about it. Why is that? Because it's a taboo. Climate politicians don't like to talk about solar geoengineering. Even climate scientists don't really like to talk about it. And the main reason here is they don't want to let the genie out of the bottle. They want to avoid the moral hazard thing. Let's keep that technology secret. And if ever we might need it in the year 2050 or 2060, well, it'll be enough time then to use this. I don't agree. I don't think that this is a rational approach to it, especially because it's very clear that solar geoengineering is not, or the question about solar geoengineering is not about if it'll be done, but rather when, by whom, and how. That's a quote from an American-Austrian climate economist called Gernot Wagner on my Sprint podcast. And actually, it's even not sharp enough because it's already done. There's a Silicon Valley-based startup, where else, called Make Sunsets, who has found the brilliant business model of selling what they call cooling credits. So sort of equivalent to CO2 certificates. In a sense, they bring up small amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere with these cheap balloons. That works, actually. Such a balloon you can buy it at Amazon for, I don't know, $20 or $30. And then they pop in the stratosphere, and the sulfur dioxide in the balloons then sort of diffuses up there. This is more a marketing stunt. It's by far not enough stuff they bring up there. However, it's a clear sign that there are people thinking about it, and that there are people who are thinking about building business models with it and leaving solar geoengineering to markets is very obviously the best way into the next ice age. Because if you can make money by putting as much up as you can, and if it's not regulated, well, it's very likely that we end up with far too much sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere. What Make Sense is doing is called among climate scientists rogue geoengineering. The tricky thing about solar geoengineering is it's not hard to do. You just have to adapt a couple of business planes that can fly as high. You could build up a fleet of large balloons, stratospheric balloons, that brings up tons up there. So basically, many stakeholders could do it. A small coalition of sub-Saharan states could do it. The emerging powers, countries like Indonesia or India or China, of course, or Saudi Arabia, they could do it. Easy. Or even, I don't know, a super rich person that wants to save the world because it knows better than anyone else could do it. So that's called the Greenville scenario, a Bond-like villain. Among the critics of solar geoengineering, you often hear the name Bill Gates in that context. What is true is that Bill Gates is invested in geoengineering companies. He's financing solar geoengineering research. But what we know from him as well is that he is a law-abiding citizen of the US and that he's at least become a very, very responsible philanthropist. But, well, there are other people with narcissist traits, I think, in their character, which might have a couple of rockets under their belts. So these types could indeed do it easily. We cannot leave a technology that is cheap and powerful, leave to people who might do it rogue, or even small coalitions of state who might do it. It's high time, first of all, to invest in research. Solar geoengineering is one of the few research questions where even among scientists, or at least part of climate scientists, say that we should not research it. I thought we've been beyond that since Enlightenment, but interesting. We need the science, we need the knowledge in order to enter into rational decision making. It'll be a hard decision to do it or not to do it. But good decisions are those that are good or well-informed decisions. And then we need an answer to the question, who should do it? Most likely, or in an ideal scenario, a large majority of all countries of the world in the UN came together and would find a global governance structure, would find criteria that would enable rational decision-making based on research. In a world as divided as the one we are living in, that sounds on the one hand very optimistic. On the other hand, climate policy is one of the very few areas where there seems to be global understanding. So I hope for that. I think there are signals in the present that with rising temperatures, the world in the UN would be able to come together and think rationally about the question if we should do it or if we should not do it. Would it be too risky? Well, I don't know. everybody who claims who would know it is a charlatan. We can't know it from today's perspective. We don't have the research yet. But what I know is it'll be a risk versus risk scenario. It is risky to do it, but how risky is it? Basically, always repeating that, oh, we have to decarbonize and we still believe in the Paris process, while knowing we won't decarbonize fast enough. Very likely not. I mean, miracles aside. That's a famous quote within the solar geoengineering community. It's a bad idea whose time has come. It hasn't come yet. But in the 30s, 40s, around the mid of the century, it is very likely that humanity will say, yeah, it's a bad idea, but we have to do it. Because if we don't do it, things will get worse. The world will go off the rails. And a coalition of sub-Saharan states or whatever will not accept to not do it. We all know there's no planet B. On planet A, if you do it, or if you don't do solar geoengineering, the decision will affect every single human, and not only every single human, every single plant, and every single animal, any single species on this world. So, we should start this debate, science-based, rationally, and while looking for government structures, global government structures that could make sense. And we should consider it now, because possibly, if we don't start doing it, if we don't start the research right now, we'll end up in a world where somebody will do it, but in an irresponsible way. Thank you very much.